And the Millennium Villages Project took a very simple concept, which was, if we take all these basic recommendations, the fertilizer, the bed nets, the clean drinking water, the school meals programs, and we actually just worked with communities in the poorest parts of the world to implement them with just a little bit of financial support, $60 per person per year, these communities could probably achieve the global goals that were set, as Lindsay so eloquently said, as a galvanizing force for global partnership. And what we saw in the Millennium Villages, for me, was striking in a way I actually didn't anticipate. I'm a macroeconomist by training, so I was never trained to think at the village or community level. And what we've seen is that the social connections within communities are so powerful, and people, through basic instinct, know how to connect the dots, but they're never supported to connect the dots, so with just some basic tools, they have remarkable transformations and takeoff. So we're now working with about 500,000 people in 12 locations in 10 countries in rural Africa. And across the board, they've all at least doubled food production, some places 5-fold increases. Enrollments are up 20%. There's 80,000 children now getting school meals linked to the boost in enrollments. We have more than 300,000 bed nets delivered within the first 6 months alone. I recently saw the data from one of the sites that 2 years later, 96% of the households in the site are still using their bed nets, regularly. And this was not that complicated, but it was very practical, and it required thinking across disciplines and across sectors to help communities do the things they need to do. And so this, for me, was very powerful because it showed in a very profound way what success looks like for the people for whom success is supposed to be meaningful. And these communities are already well on their way to achieving the Millennium Development Goals. And we were very proud. We just had an external review done by a leading think tank in the UK, and they said this is actually showing remarkable results and how basic investments and support programs working with communities can achieve the Millennium Development Goals in rural Africa. But the other part that was amazing, or has been amazing, is how many people outside of the governments, and I'm not dissing governments, I'm just saying the people who normally wouldn't consider it their job want to be part of this. So we were just in Fayetteville and talking with Tyson leadership about how they can mobilize their expertise in poultry and initiating poultry farms in places where they've never worked, using the boosted food production as feed to help the households grow chickens and sell eggs. They're going to be much better at that than I am, that's for sure. And that's really important. We have Ericsson, the cell phone company, providing internet connectivity to all of our villages through their normal business processes, because they said, we got to figure this out. We need to make sure we know what it looks like to help connect every community in the world. And so we're just going to do this and put your communities at the front of the line. We have Novartis contributing those anti-malaria medicines. We have Sumitomo contributing its bed nets. But crucially, we also have communities across this country and around the world that are mobilizing themselves to get engaged. They're using the Millennium Villages because they were looking for a vehicle to show how the Millennium Development Goals can be achieved, and they've mobilized their schools, their churches, their communities. They're giving seminars on the Millennium Development Goals. I heard 2 days ago about a seminar being given on the Millennium Development Goals in a Sunday school. It was a incredibly well-attended thing. And it's part of a whole 0.7 campaign of the church to give, which is part of the broader global effort to make sure 0.7% of national income is committed to these things. But what we've basically seen is how all the hands on deck actually contribute to a breakthrough. And what we've also seen is how all the hands on deck have helped spur in several countries of our partner countries in Africa incredible breakthroughs, where so many of the communities and so many of the local political leaders are just infused with energy to take this forward. So in Mali, the president and his government have put forward a plan to scale this up to 2 million people. In Malawi, the president said he's a long leader in many of these issues. He's now said, based on this success, he wants every village a Millennium Village in Malawi. Nigeria is now talking about spreading this to every state. And this was all normal people leading this. This was private individuals, private companies, private groups of faith, schools, universities, and so forth that actually provided this momentum, working with the communities and the local leadership in a sense of global partnership in society. So I actually think, going back to this uncertainty where I started out, we need to be learning to think in different ways to solve global problems. We need to be learning to think across disciplines. We need to be learning to think across communities and constituencies. And we really need to be learning to think across countries and cultures as part of our normal life. So with Millennium Promise, this is what we're open for business to do. Is if you have an idea on how you think the Millennium Development Goals could be achieved, or you want to be part of any of this, we're here to work with you. If you're interested in the academic part, I'll put on my Earth Institute hat and helping to train people. This is what we want to do. We want to help train the next generation to lead on these problems. But above all, amidst the challenge, I think we've also seen how quickly the takeoff can happen. We've seen in malaria control what was considered an impossible or forgotten problem a few years ago. We now have literally tens of millions of bed nets being distributed in the past 2 years alone, and we had a pledge as of September of this year that every infectious sleeping site in Africa would be sleeping under a bed net by 2010, and $3 billion of global funding mobilized from about 100 million a year just a couple years ago. AIDS, the AIDS crisis, in 2001, there was no one in Africa on externally supported AIDS treatment. And today we have more than 2 million people on AIDS treatment. It's an issue that everyone considered impossible just a few years ago, and now it's a no-brainer. It's on its way to full completion. The food crisis, that's hit many countries. We've seen Malawi, amidst all the naysaying in the world, double its food production, an entire country in 1 year, and then sustain that 3 years in a row since 2005. Malawi, one of the poorest places on the planet, has doubled its food production 3 years in a row because the president said, I want my households and my farmers to use fertilizer. Amidst all the naysaying, he just said, let's do this. And now everyone in the world is celebrating Malawi's success, and everyone's going to visit to see how they can do it too. So amidst the uncertainty, I'm actually pretty optimistic. But more deeply than that, I'm actually often asked, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the Millennium Development Goals? And my answer, because it's my job to think about it, is actually I'm neither. These goals are achievable. These problems are solvable. And I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic. I'm actually just grateful that we have the choice of whether we're going to achieve them. And there's a phrase in the Millennium Declaration of 2000 which set the Millennium Development Goals, and it said, we will spare no effort to free our fellow men, women, and children from the abject and dehumanizing conditions to which more than 1 billion people are currently subjected. And for me, that's the Millennium Promise. Will we spare no effort in every instance where we have the practical choice of what we're going to do to solve global problems, to think practically about solutions, and to make sure it's a shared fate for common humanity for generations to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for willing to speak with us tonight. We're going to take a few questions, and I think we have some microphones around the room. Just be patient. We'll get those to you.
Thank you so much. That was so encouraging. I'm Sister Joan Pitlick, and I spent the year of 2004 at the UN as an intern with an NGO working on poverty, and it just seems so impossible. And I see how you're doing it one village at a time. But what surprises me or something is that, like in this country, I would say most people probably don't even know what the Millennium Development Goals are. And I think of in Arkansas, I think it's the Southern Bancorp or something that is doing a project somewhat like that in Phillips County in the Delta, which is very poor. And they're putting all their resources into this, everything from charter schools to et cetera. And they're having so much success. And I wondered if you thought of doing something in the more first world countries to try to model something or connect things that are happening with the goals so that people would become aware of them and become aware of the needs in the really third world or countries, whatever. But anyway, you have such a wonderful model, and I think there are little things of it, it's just no connection.
I think we're not focused. There's considerable poverty and tremendous poverty and worsening right now in this country, and that's certainly not to be misunderstood in any way. The type of poverty that exists in the poorest parts of the world is quite different conceptually and practically. So we are in no way, and myself, I would never want to underestimate the challenge and the priorities here, but we're actually focused on a different type of challenge. Now, that said, the notion of integrated and holistic approaches for communities based on the fact that we all have an integrated set of needs, I think is a common principle. And you often hear, oh, is education or health the next most important thing? We have to make choices. I consider that a false choice, actually. That, to me, I like to say is like saying, do I want my heart or my lungs or my brain? Because I'd like both, or all those above, and I'd like both health and education. We probably want that for our kids, too, and we'd like them to have clean drinking water. Both because all of them matter, but also because they're all interconnected. So if you have health but not education, then your health isn't going to be as good. If you have education but no health, your education isn't going to be as good. And if you're missing clean drinking water, then the whole thing applies equally. Now, on the goals, this is where the public voices matter and the public recognition. Now, President-elect Obama has very clearly indicated his support for the goals. The previous administration, I'll put it politely, was lukewarm for several years on the goals. And only in 2005 did President Bush say the words Millennium Development Goals in a row for the first time. And so that actually mattered for the world, and that's why there was less discussion about it. Now, in other countries, they're very well known, and our leaders talk about it a lot. In this country, I think there's a real role for those who care and those who are interested and those who want to take this up, to make sure that this is a topic of public discussion for two reasons. One is because we care. The other is because they're actually in a global agreement, and that's good governance for us, is to follow through on our agreements. So having spoken with many of the people over the past couple of years who are around the transition team, I know that many, many of them are very committed to this agenda. The deep concern, though, is when everything important is getting crowded out by the urgent, will it still be heard? And that's our job as publics, is to make sure it's heard and to give them the space by showing what success looks like, so everyone's a winner by getting behind this. And that's why so many of the programs that so many of the people in the room are involved with, I think, are so crucial, because this isn't about grand theory. This is about practical success and showing what success looks like. And I want to be clear, it's not me in the villages, it's the people in the villages. They're the ones doing all the work. I do a lot more email than they do work. Or pardon me, I do a lot more email than work. They do a lot more work than I do email. They work all the time, and these are leaders, and there's community leaders, and just like any community, they're very impressive, and when they get momentum, wow, is it amazing. And so it's just basic tools in general, and opportunities and tools is what it all boils down to. And so that's what the goals really force us to think about.
You mentioned the population, the 9 billion. Is that a focus at all in right now, trying to do something about that?
This is a great question, and I think the world is gotten so used to fast-growing population that it's a little bit come to accept it. And that's not, and the 9 billion is around what's projected to be the plateau, and then it'll even off a bit. So it's not infinite growth, but there are basic things that are being done when we don't know it to affect fertility rates. Total fertility rates is the technical measure of number of births a woman has over her lifetime. And there's a basic package of things that brings down total fertility rates. One is decreasing child mortality. So the higher the survival rate of your children, typically the less children you'll have. Second is girls' education. That's important for two reasons. One is the more educated they are, the more economic opportunities they have, the more empowered they are to make their own choices. But the second is that while they're in school, they're more likely to delay their first birth to a later stage. And so that delayed onset actually shortens the reproductive lifespan, and it just compresses in many ways. A third, though, is access to contraception, which is generally part of, and that's a very local discussion typically in different countries with different aspects, obviously a sensitive topic in many places, but overwhelmingly access to contraception has been a major part of decreasing fertility rates. So malaria control actually, which has a major effect on decreasing child mortality rates, should have some effect on decreasing fertility rates. We're a little bit behind the curve on girls' secondary education, well behind the curve. This has not yet got enough global attention or global financing. And on access to contraception, this has been, I think, a slightly undiscussed topic at an international level for many years. It pops up every so often, but it doesn't get anywhere near the systematic attention that other global issues are getting.
I think we have time for about one more question.
My name is Maria. I've been reading a lot about Africa, and a lot you hear in the news about military attacks in some countries in Africa, and a lot of times people are isolated from their food, from their shelter. So I was wondering if we're going to help communities to provide them with food, help them with food, with water. What if these military attacks are going to continue? And do we have to do something with that? Can we help with that? Because I believe that a lot of people just don't get food and shelter just because of that.
Sorry, I had trouble hearing. A shelter tax?
No. Military attacks in Africa, in Rwanda, for example, in Kenya.
Attacks.
I'm sorry. I have an accent. I have an accent, yeah.
Got it.
So that's what I'm saying. Because of this military attacks, people a lot of times are isolated from water, although they have water, or they're isolated from food, although they have food. And you're saying you help in these communities, and they're trying to build something. But what the military attack happened, and everything is broken, and you have to build it once again.
So I think there's a real need to keep in mind how big a place Africa is, how many countries there are, and the diversity of experiences underway and the diversity of histories. So, Robert Mugabe gets a lot of headlines these days. And a lot of people in this country think that's Africa. Well, it's actually not. It's one country, and it's a particularly pernicious example, but it's just one country, and it's certainly different from, say, Mali, where the president is democratically reelected recently, very open society, just extreme poverty. Utterly different and not comparable. Then there's another side of the equation, which is that poorer places are actually much more likely to fall into conflict. And that's a kind of statistical truth, but also places that are more subject to economic shocks, and especially rainfall-induced shocks when the economy depends on rainfall, are even more likely still. So a lot of what we're talking about, even for those places where, societies pushed to the brink under extreme circumstances often go over the brink, and that's not to excuse anything, but just to understand underlying dynamics. And in my own view, that's part of why we've seen, and the evidence for it is extremely strong, the Band of the Sahel is such a conflict zone. These are places that are under incredible societal stresses, and that boils over. So, keeping in mind that the diversity and the stress, the diversity of cases and the stress, I don't work in military zones personally, and I go to a lot of places, so that's my own bias sample. But part of what we're also talking about is building the resilience in the economy and in the society to get that first stage of development so that the risks of instability are that much lower. And that instability is certainly very pronounced locally, but this is also a global interest. And part of what we've seen, and time again in recent years, is that sources of instability, and pick your country, has actually, in some of the places we thought were the most remote and disconnected parts of the world, absolutely came to be sources of instability for us too, on other sides of the planet. So we're really talking about how to build the resilience, build the stability. We can never explain away politics, but put in place the conditions that make the situation as promising as possible.